What's up, STS Nation? Welcome to a Sunday night special edition of Surviving the Survivor. Great to be with you this evening. We are, of course, the podcast that brings you the best guests in true crime, hashtag best guests. And you'll find out why we say that in just one moment. Today marks exactly 2 months to the day since 4 young University of Idaho students were savagely murdered, stabbed to death in their off-campus Moscow, Idaho home. Let us take a moment to never forget those young lives lost way too soon. Got Madison Mogen, 21, Kaylee Goncalves, 21, Xana Kernodle, 20, and Ethan Chapin, 20. May their memories always be a blessing. Police say the killer is 28-year-old Bryan Christopher Kohberger. We want to remind everyone during the course of this show that Bryan Kohberger is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. I've got a criminal defense attorney here to back me up on that, and we'll lead off with him. Our best guests today in the I can't really tell, Tim, but Tim Jansen's there with a closet door behind him. He's handled complex civil, administrative, and criminal litigation, first as Chief Trial Counsel for the Secretary of State of Florida, Tallahassee, handling both complex civil and criminal matters. And he was also a federal prosecutor, so he knows both sides of the aisle when it comes to the law. The man in the beard joining us for the first time, for which we are grateful, is Dr. Samuel P. Newton. Before joining the University of Idaho College of Law, you heard that right, he is from the University of Idaho. He worked for both prosecuting and public defender organizations in Utah and Montana, focusing much of his practice on appellate advocacy and capital defense litigation. He is a licensed attorney in Colorado, Montana, and Utah, and holds a PhD, which is why he's a lawyer and a doctor. The man who looks like a Hollywood FBI agent is Bobby Chacon. Special Agent Bobby Chacon is a retired FBI agent, attorney, and writer who advises television shows and movies on FBI-related issues, as well as provides commentary to national news outlets regarding law enforcement, counterterrorism, and other matters, mainly involving the FBI. And last but not least, joining us in a pinch is former Agent Scott Duffy. Agent Duffy is the director of Wilmington University's Criminal Justice Institute. He's a retired FBI supervisory special agent of the Wilmington, Delaware resident agency. He worked violent crime matters, gangs, bank robberies, you name it, he's done it. And he was a police officer for 5 years in Pennsylvania before that. Remember, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. On Twitter, we're at Podcast STS. You can support us on Patreon, and we're starting a YouTube subscription if you'd like to join us there. And as my 8-year-old daughter says, please hit that subscribe and like button as it helps the algorithm. I've got to start with Dr. Newton. Obvious first question to you. When news broke that police had a suspect, how did everything change for you in Moscow, Idaho?
Yeah, I'd say that you might be able to say there was a collective sigh of relief. I think it's a community in anxiety, a community that was worried, and understandably so. The students, a lot of pressure being put on the police, but also a lot of community togetherness and a lot of reaching out and support. So I think, yeah, you could feel that there was a collective sigh of relief that the police seemed to have found a decent suspect there.
For those of you who are not watching live, this will obviously replay. I'm going to try to get the audience involved, hashtag STS Nation, as much as possible. But let us just hash out a couple of things first, even though I've got the first question up there. And back to you, Dr. Newton. While this was all playing out in real time before this apprehension, what was the feeling in Moscow? Was it dread? Was it apprehension? What was the feeling like?
I would say when we were in school in session and just before the break, I'd say there was a heaviness in the community and a lot of worry and a lot of anxiety among students, parents, community members as to who could be behind this. Do the police have any leads? I'd say there was a sense of frustration maybe too as well, that are the police doing something? Why aren't they releasing more information? Maybe discussions of there's been some back and forth, like, well, you don't need to be worried. Oh, maybe you do need to be worried. And so there's a lot of that. But at the same time, we've had community vigils. We've had a lot of support, outpouring of support from around the nation and world, really, of people reaching out and to the community. In this community, we had a huge vigil at the university. And so it's like these contrary forces at play, right? A lot of grief, a lot of worry, a lot of anxiety, but also outpouring of love, support, connection, people talking to each other like never before. I think so. It's what these tragedies do, right?
Yeah. And when does I remember that vividly, right? I worked down at the World Trade Center on 9/11. We were never more unified as a country. So horrible stories can sometimes bring a community together. When do classes resume? And are you expecting, there was a question beforehand how many people would return. Are you expecting all the students to return now?
I think we'll have much more attendance. I had some worry about that because the university in the past had said the students didn't have to attend, and we had quite light attendance at the end of the year. And so there's that, a very personal thing of, okay, everyone will feel more comfortable probably coming to class.
So the great Bobby Chacon is here, and he's shaking his head. It is true. So, and he has to jump off, and then we'll rejoin us. I want to get him a question before he has to get cracking. And I'm going to unmute him here. So there is the podcast Hidden True Crime. Shout out to them. And they kind of broke some news today of, or it might have been yesterday, of some uncovered documents in a health form that were reportedly posted by Bryan Kohberger. This is not 100% confirmed, but it's out there. A lot of people are talking about it. It comes from a 17-year-old Bryan Kohberger back in 2011, who was obviously really struggling mentally. He talks about something called visual snow, basically saying he had a medical condition consisting of migraines and toxins, and said that every test known to man cannot show what's wrong with us. Bobby, I'm curious if you saw this and what you think about these writings potentially from this 17-year-old suspect.
I haven't seen it because there's been some other stuff also unconfirmed that has popped up in the last 24 hours that I've been asked to review and things like that. But, first thing is we have to authenticate that this is actually from the actual defendant in this case. So that's the first hurdle you have to get over. Is this authentic? Before you start spending too much time and effort analyzing something or trying to find meaning in it, you really should authenticate it first, because all of that time and effort is wasted if ultimately it turns out that this isn't authenticated, it's not legitimate. Even if it is the ramblings of a teenager 10 or 11 years ago, even if it is this defendant, I think is going to be of minimal value. The defense might try to use something like this in its defense. The defense is going to have a lot of thinking to do. They're going to look at the evidence and they're going to come up with a defense strategy. But something that happened 10 or 11 years ago, look, as an investigator, there were two objectives I had: who did the crime and how do I prove it? And so far the investigators seem to have that, and they're going in those directions, answering those two questions. Everything else is kind of ancillary to those two questions, and more a concern for the defense team that's probably going to be built in the next few weeks.
Great point. And again, if I was back in network news, I would not run with it, would not be able to run with it. But this is my show and I can do things my way right now. And again, it is not corroborated, but I saw enough out there to think that it could be something. So interesting to get that perspective, but we definitely will not labor it. But Tim, to you, if you're defending this suspect and these writings, which are allegedly his, come up, are you already angling somehow for your defense strategy to say, look, when this kid was 17 years old, he was already having issues, spare him the death penalty or whatever it might be?
Well, you always have a team. Usually my investigator, she's already on social media, on the footprint to see what we can find. Looking at his mental history, you'll talk to the family members and see if he's ever had treatment and been diagnosed, if he's taken any drug for any abnormal behavior. They've described some abnormal behavior about him being a vegan and being so OCD that he won't eat out of a plate that had meat in it. Really abnormal to an extreme. I take it his behavior is described by kids that knew him in high school was very odd. He kind of tried to fit in, but never fit in. So you're going to have one angle. That's a mental health issue, but you got other issues that are much bigger that go to the issue of guilt, which is the touch DNA, which is going to be the phone, which is going to be the ID that puts him at the location, and then the people today, you can't get anywhere without leaving a footprint. He tried to turn his phone off, which is a red flag. His phone's on all the time until the time of the murder, and then the phone's off. Well, that might be a coincidence, but it's not really, especially when you see the vehicle on King Street all before the murder, and then you see a car matching the description right after. So the defense team, they're in so many different directions right now. And I have a feeling once they do the car, I can't believe if he is the perpetrator, there's not going to be some blood or DNA from one of the victims in his car. I just cannot believe that.
First question, let's get right into them because this is about STS Nation. Comes from Jesse Goal, kind of like Joel, but with the G. Mr. Newton, that's Dr. Newton, or anyone else. If Bryan Christopher Kohberger pleads guilty, how much more evidence or details will be released that we would typically hear about during a jury trial? Dr. Newton, if you want to take that.
No, that's fine. I think it would depend on the scope of the investigation and what is released. If he were to enter a plea relatively quickly, there may not be as much investigation just because the police won't be doing this as much. If they're preparing for a big trial and it takes, months, years to get there might be quite a bit of evidence generated as a part of that process. Whether that becomes public is a question for the court to reveal some of that detail. Right now the court has issued gag orders, so there's some restriction there. But I know there's some suits pending. The public does have a right to know most of the workings of government, so there would have to be some sort of compelling need to not disclose it. But a lot might come out. It would just depend maybe at what stage.
Thanks, Dr. Newton. Bobby, to you, since you have the law degree, Ariana Grande's ponytail, there you go, an LA thing here too. This guy will never plead guilty. He wants to fight this every step of the way. Do you buy that?
I really, as an investigator, I kind of contain myself to the facts. I don't know enough about him, whether he's that kind of guy. We simply don't know yet. I will say this, in relation to the last question, when a defendant pleads guilty, they have to stand up in court and do what's called an allocution, which means the judge will demand that the defendant put on the record what he did to commit this crime. So he will have to stand up in open court and describe killing these people. That's part of a guilty plea. When you allocute to the charges, you have to meet the elements of that crime statutorily. And so he will have to get up on the record in court and say the things that he did. So we will at least hear that as part of his allocution in a guilty plea.
Unless
if he pleads.
Unless he does an Alfred plea, and then the government would
if he does an Alfred plea, it'll be. I mean, lots of us have problems with Alfred pleas, and hopefully they're going to go away eventually. But in this kind of case, it would really be unusual for an Alfred plea, which is but you don't accept responsibility for the acts. It's an anomaly in the law.
Yeah, and in that case, the government would put on the facts.
Scott, to you, Agent Duffy, I'm curious, what stood out to you most about this affidavit, this probable cause affidavit that you think is most problematic for the defendant?
Well, it's a well-written affidavit. It has what I think is the bare bone facts in order to get this guy off the street. There's plenty of investigation left to do. There's plenty of interviews left to do. I think the affidavit puts just enough in it that these guys were under the microscope, and so with that being said, it shows a lot. It includes who's involved: the FBI, the Idaho State Police, and other agencies. It talks about the CAST, FBI's CAST, which is the Cellular Analysis Surveillance Team. It's an elite unit that really goes through the phone and will help build the journey, everything that Bryan Kohberger has done leading up to the murder, the day of the murder, and of course the days afterwards. So it really does. It is probable cause, and now of course you have to prove it beyond the reasonable doubt. So it's a good start.
Excellent. Tim, on to you. We did get some questions written into us in advance. This one comes from Mr. Dave, 1963. How likely is the chance that the defense will have Bryan Christopher Kohberger testify in court?
I'm not so sure he's going to go to trial, but if he's going to testify, that's like a decision you make, but you don't make. You prepared to do it, but you prepare as though you're not going to call them to be a witness. Opens them up to cross-examination. He might have to answer some questions that the state may not be able to get in evidence in, and he'll have to make I don't know if he's made a statement. I haven't heard anything that he said. I heard his lawyer say he was going to be exonerated. I heard him say that, has anybody else been arrested? He's clever, but he's not smart. And you're not going to fool the FBI, and you're not going to fool the law enforcement when they team together. So they're going to have so much for cross-examination of him that it's probably not a good idea for him to testify.
And Dr. Newton, let's go to this question here from Ann Vroom. My guess is defense scenario might be, yes, he was a creepy lurker, but never went in the house. Just coincidence he was there. Knife, sheath, DNA. Oh, someone maybe showed him that before and he touched it. How believable is that from a defense strategy?
So I would say my practice, not all defense attorneys are this way, but when I was practicing, I would ask the client, just start with them, like, here's the charges, here's what's going down. And surprisingly, even on a capital case, a lot of them will admit responsibility. But then we're looking at, okay, do you want to accept responsibility? Are we trying to mitigate the death sentence? Are we going that direction? If Kohberger was saying, hey, look, I'm not guilty, then it's like, all right, we got to jump into full investigation mode. They've got the FBI on their side who has investigated this and got you here, there, and whatever, right? And they've got your DNA there. So we've got to start coming up with, like, how could that possibly be there? And I would be asking those questions. Where do I need to start my investigation? Is it possible? Did you interact with any of these people? Did you give them a knife sheath? Is there some way that would happen? We would have to start coming up together. And I would say the client really runs that with, they're saying you were there. Were you there? Were you not? What are we going to do? And then if they're not, then okay, let's look at your cell phone. Maybe I can find location data myself to show you were somewhere else. Or were you with people? Or, so the client really has to dictate a lot of the defense, I think, in many respects.
Agent Duffy, this one is for you. From Neela Smith. Will the FBI charge him as well for crossing the state border to commit the crime, or is that only if the state is unable to get a conviction?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there are charges for interstate commerce. That's any time somebody travels interstate. So if he's left Washington with the intention of committing a crime in another state, there is a viable charge there. The difficult part is you really have to show that he was intending and planning this in another state. So it adds to there's a couple of more hurdles to jump over. But yes, there are obvious federal charges that could be levied if it was decided that some things were not working out, and you can see that in different locations where homicide is charged and then a civil rights violation is charged on the federal level, and sometimes they run concurrent, sometimes one is dropped, but yeah, the FBI can absolutely levy a charge for planning and as long as they could show that the perpetrator was planning and intending and followed through with that action while in another state. Okay.
We can't hear you.
Okay. So it got muted.
That was my
so-
fault.
No.
I'm good. I'm back. So, Dr. Newton, the question on the screen for you from Iris Hewlett: the affidavit does not disclose the type of DNA on the leather sheath. It sounds like they have only touch. Otherwise, why not say blood DNA? Is that problematic for the state?
Yeah, absolutely. Touch DNA is a lot more transferable, right? So if, for example, I'll throw a theory out there, which is, let's say Mr. Kohberger handed that sheath that belonged to him to a friend who happened to go there. Of course, his skin cells are going to be on that, and that doesn't necessarily put him in the room as much as blood DNA would, for sure, would be a lot more compelling piece of evidence. It could still show that he's there. But because touch DNA can be so easily transferred, I can shake your hand and get your DNA on my hand and then transfer that DNA to another location, and that becomes a problem.
I have a question now for Tim. Tim, I'll unmute you here. If Bryan Christopher Kohberger's DNA is found in the mouth of a victim or under the fingernails of the victim, how likely is it that his defense attorney would suggest he pleads guilty with a life sentence as a maximum penalty? For example, if one of the victims bit him or scratched him in self-defense.
Well, obviously, he's going to be talking to the prosecutor, looking at all the evidence. Your job as a defense lawyer is to make sure he gets a fair trial. At some point, you have to advise your client. He's going to listen to your advice, hopefully, and you're going to tell him where the cards stack up. And you make no guarantees, but at some point, you have to let him know. You have to have client control. Unless he just says, I'm going to go to trial, I don't care what happens. But if you have client control, at some point you go to the prosecutor, see if they're willing to make a deal so that, hey, can we work this deal where we don't have to go to trial? We don't have to have the family go through this. We don't have to show the autopsy pictures. We don't have to, all that. Will you agree to give them a life sentence? And see what the posture is, because they're going to contact the family. It's probably too soon right now. And then you have to go back to your client and say, listen, it's not one piece of evidence that is overwhelming and can be overwhelming. Circumstantial evidence cases are much stronger than just eyewitness evidence. If you look at all the cases overturned by Project Innocence, they were all done by eyewitness testimony. So DNA, the phone, his car, the description by the victim, all those play into what's a jury going to find. And then you have to have control, or you go back to the prosecutor and say, listen, we're going to do everything we can to make sure he gets a fair trial. I'm going to cross-examine. I'm going to call experts, and I understand your position.
That's an interesting point about the Innocence Project. Never thought of that, but brought up by a suave criminal defense attorney. Agent Duffy, this one's for you. Did the FBI video / film Bryan Christopher Kohberger cleaning his car at 4 a.m., putting the garbage in the neighbor's bins whilst wearing surgical gloves? Will that footage be shown at trial? Thank you. Is that SOP for them to film this?
Yeah, so if all that information is true, wherever the FBI had surveilled Bryan, during the whole course of, I guess, when he was identified to the point that the FBI joined the surveillance portion of this up until the time of his arrest. I can guarantee everything as much as possible is videotaped, plenty of pictures to go around, drones, whatever have you. Whatever is being recorded from pen to paper by the surveilling agents or support whoever's doing the surveillance, there's also recording of the same, and it would be used. It would be turned over to the authorities in Idaho to support the trial. So anything that the FBI has developed would in fact be turned over, and yes, it would be released when the courts deemed so.
And Counselor Jansen, this is from your neck of the woods. There are a lot of comparisons, some rightly so, others seemingly unjustified, to Ted Bundy. A lot of people obviously say he was nowhere near, at the level, which is kind of a morbid and macabre thing to say. But this person, Ann Vroom, says, I think of Ted Bundy in court, just completely enjoying, perversely claiming innocence in the face of the totality of evidence against him. Have you had criminal defendants who just enjoy the process of being out there, knowing that they are guilty?
I had one client who was a modern day Rambo, was in prison for 17 years, got out and committed some heinous crimes, attempted to kidnap a police officer's wife, claimed that her husband was in the hospital, and he was looking to escape. He was going to go to trial. They offered him, he's looking at life in prison. He wasn't going to take any plea. They had the Bundy brace on him, which is a brace that folds, so if you try to run, you can't. And he wasn't going to take a plea. And no matter what I told him, he went to trial. And yeah, you have some that just enjoy it.
Wow. Crazy to think, but that is perverse human nature, I guess. Next question, Dr. Newton, we'll throw this to you from Vicky. How can they argue DNA on the sheath without him on the stand? Is it plausible to do that or no?
No, I presume this person is asking how would the defense argue that it's not his DNA on the sheath?
That's right. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, they could still attack the government's evidence. So they could cross-examine the state's witnesses. They could put on their own DNA experts to say that the sample size, for example, wasn't large enough, or that they have a mixture. This is real common in DNA. There's a mixture. There's a variety of errors that could happen in the analysis. If there's no errors on the DNA end, they could still make the arguments by usually cross-examining state's witnesses. And so you can do that without having to put the defendant on the stand.
And then Agent Duffy, to you, this is more of a psychological question. This was from earlier from KK Enterprises. I'm wondering if Kohberger thinks he's so smart, he thought he could get off if he got caught via his defense, meaning that he would just get off because his defense would get him off. Do you think he thought he was infallible, uncatchable?
Well, I guess that remains to be seen. He is caught, so that's one good thing. The state has made an affidavit, and that got a judge to sign a not only an arrest warrant for Bryan Kohberger, but subsequent search warrants, and so they are diving into all his computer searches, anything, any of his writings. As there were writings from him being at 17. Just imagine what could be written that's in his apartment that's never made it into social media or on the airwaves. So there's a tremendous amount of evidence that that law enforcement, I think, is daily gaining as a result of their push forward. So it will be interesting to see what happens as this moves forward in a very public light through the court process, and what in fact comes to bear with regards to him and his psychological wherewithal.
Next question up there, Tim, I'll throw this one to you. It comes from Momo, and it's sort of in jest, but putting it up there for a reason. He'll go to trial to delay going to prison. I'm afraid he'll learn more about the use of vegetables other than a vegan diet. If he is found guilty in a court of law, a defendant like this, what is his future like behind bars? I mean, he's, as they say in the military, a high-value target among the prisoners, isn't he?
In Florida, you're going to go to death row, and they're usually separated from other inmates. They usually get their own cell, and they're not around most people in a normal cell. One thing I thought was fascinating looking at the affidavit, and it's very well done. And you look at the police officer, 4 years experience as a police officer, 4 years. And he wrote this. This is outstanding work for an officer with 4 years experience. The detail was excellent. And at FBI, it was really done well. And normally when you first look at it, you're going to look, okay, how experienced is this officer? 4 years, he was a police officer. So luckily, he's going to have people with experience, a lot more experience, that are in this affidavit, that it's going to be hard to cross-examine their experience and their tests and their results.
Tim, a follow-up to that, we had, and then we'll take this question, we had a retired FBI agent, Jeff Wood, out of Boston on, and when he read the affidavit and saw that it was this Corporal Brett Payne with only 4 years experience, he wrote this to me. I'm curious to get your take. They used a rarely junior officer, 4 years on the force, to file the affidavit. This is a ploy in order to keep most of their evidence away from the defense team until discovery. This is done to help keep the officer from revealing too much information during a hearing. We have done this in my cases. Is that something that happens? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, it happens quite a bit, especially in federal court. You'll have a case agent working a case, and the case agent will sit at the table, and you're expecting the government to call the case agent, and the government never calls the case agent because he never really did anything. All he did was he collected evidence from everybody else. I've seen inexperienced defense lawyers not put a subpoena on an officer they thought the state was going to call, and evidence that would have been favorable to the defense was not admissible because they didn't have a witness. I'm not sure what they were thinking when they did 4 years and then I have to turn it over. I guarantee you there's more evidence that they have than they put in a probable cause. That standard is so low to get a threshold to get a warrant probable cause. It's very low. I think there's a lot more evidence, and I guarantee you he did not clean that car, that the FBI would not be able to find some evidence in that car. I would be shocked.
Which leads us to the next question. And Dr. Newton, I'll toss this one to you. Dr. Newton is an attorney and a professor at the University of Idaho in Moscow. This is from 9 on a Dime. 2 questions for one here. What are the chances of recovering the victim's DNA in the car after it was thoroughly cleaned? Let's take that one first.
Yeah, I would say that it's a good chance. And the magic of luminol is we often just, a defendant thinks they've cleaned something very well until they shine luminol on it. And then they can find the spots of blood. They can find enough that they can usually test. Not to say this can't be done and that it can't be thoroughly cleaned out. I had a homicide where the defendant did a very good job and they weren't able to locate that. So it can happen. But yeah, so you just asked the first. But yes, I think there's a very good chance the police could.
And let's move on to the second here. Do you all feel the prosecutors have more evidence that wasn't in the probable cause affidavit, Dr. Newton?
Of course, this is just speculation, but when I've worked on the prosecution side, sometimes, of course, you're trying to keep some of your evidence away from the defense. And so you would just put in what you think you have enough to rise to probable cause. You're not going to give them your entire case. That would be a big mistake.
And then on to you, Agent Duffy. This is not a question, but we'll get another one up there. But to you, there's been a lot of talk about this roommate, Dylan Mortensen, and I don't want to skewer anyone. In fact, I want to see if we should come to her aid a little bit. But people are saying she's the one that saw this suspect and then ran back into a room, and then a 911 call wasn't made for hours later. Do you have any experience with cases that you've handled where people just freeze in the moment? Can you speak to maybe what she was experiencing and why, there was this level of, inaction on her part as a young, very young woman?
Absolutely. So, and that's a great question. And with regards to any victim of a violent crime, and imagine the affidavit provides just a few details with regards to what the roommate might have seen or heard, and then of course putting two and two together to develop enough evidence to determine who might have been saying those words. Regardless, what's in that victim's mind, and then to be within a few feet with the suspected killer, and her not knowing yet what, but only imagining the worst. Those words put in the affidavit by the detective is very chilling. And for any victim of a violent crime, they're going to experience it in different ways, and they're going to come through it in different ways. So we don't know what the toxicology is, right? These are college students and enjoying life, never imagining for a second that something so horrific is going to take place. So life is taking place, and it is absolutely in the middle of the night. And for I've had plenty of victims of far less but yet still violent, who have frozen in time, who have provided information that I knew was contrary to surveillance videos or other corroborating evidence. And that's not to say they were lying, but that they were in sheer shock. And so they're providing information at the top of their head that could be referenced to something they had seen or heard in a movie or whatever have you, or prior violent encounter. So absolutely, it is shocking. It is not what a typical individual expects to happen to an individual who does suspect the worst, and then to be face to face with this worst case scenario of an intruder, and then for this person to retreat backwards into their room and secure that room. We don't know what took place because the affidavit's not revealing what took place in those hours. So the victim is absolutely traumatized, and whatever that victim retreated to do to try to protect themselves is as normal as can be, as victims suffer in different ways. And so I think it will come out, and tremendous assistance, not only victims assistance and law enforcement experts and all different types of interviewing that can go and unlock some of the things that are probably still locked away in the memory of this victim and other victims.
And I'm with Zen Amen here. No one should be blaming her. And then Gigi, whose comment is not up, says, I have experienced freezing from fear. You can't speak, at least in my case. Tim, I have another comment that was sent in earlier for you. It goes as follows. If Kohberger pleads not guilty and waives his right to a speedy trial, approximately how long would it be before his trial takes place?
Well, Idaho, I can't tell you how long. I can tell you I have a murder case that's going to be going on 4 years. Now, it was in the middle of COVID, but I would imagine sometimes these death penalty cases take at least a year to get all, and especially if you're going to have experts, and he doesn't have the money, so he's going to have court-appointed experts. It's going to take a while. I would not see a trial within 12 to 18 months unless he wanted a speedy trial. And that's a mistake sometimes people take. They don't think the government's ready, the state's ready, but I'm sure they're ready. And as far as the girl, the witness, we're looking at it at the prism of it was a murder scene. People 4 were killed. She's looking at it, hearing a dog bark. It's okay, I'm going to take care of you. And then she sees somebody walking with a mask on in all black. She didn't say she saw anybody with a knife. She didn't say she saw blood. She didn't even know there was a murder. And in this apartment, these college kids, she might have thought it might someone just be coming and going. So we should not be blaming her. She's a young person. She probably was out partying. She sees this coming and going and sees a guy with a mask walking. Who knows what she's thinking? But I really hope that she's going to need mental health counseling for the rest of her life. And what did she do? She gave one hell of a description of this guy that matches it pretty much to the T.
And if you all didn't see it, I think it was 2 episodes ago, we had on Kerry Rawson, who is Dennis Rader's daughter, otherwise known as the BTK serial killer. She 18 years ago was given the news that her father was arrested and is obviously still dealing with a lot of trauma from that. So you can imagine what these victims go through. This comment up here, Heather Clayton Callahan, speaking about this young University of Idaho student. She is only traumatized now, all caps. She was completely unaware of what had transpired at the time. That is to Tim's point. She froze to not be detected, not from fear. She had no reason to be fearful of the person. I guess making the point she didn't know who this guy was at the time. Agent Duffy, to you, do you think there's a chance this comes from Cisco Kid? Do you think there is a chance that Bryan Kohberger sneaked into the home previously and set up a camera?
Oh, I think anything is possible, right? It's and law enforcement has gone through, and from what I gather, law enforcement is still in possession of the crime scene. So there has been plenty of experts and plenty of law enforcement to go through that place to see if, in fact, anything like that. I would imagine they're testing any theory, and to be able to provide some sort of evidence. There were early indication, and I think Moscow PD, when they said that the community at large doesn't need really to worry, because it did seem like a targeted, rage-filled attack, right? And you go with previous patterns of what does that typically tell you, as opposed to just somebody who's robbing or burglarizing until they're caught. So there are some big questions with regards to this specific case. If he had any contact, if he was somebody who was rejected and then would result in some sort of rage revenge. But here it seems like there's a lot more on the table, and I wouldn't put it past him, especially with the evidence in the affidavit of him at least a dozen times since their months of summer of being, or at least having the car and his phone being in that area.
Bobby, I apologize. I did not see you. You were lurking in my waiting room, so apologies. I don't know how long you were there. I'd like you, just because of your experience, this young student who allegedly, according to this affidavit, witnessed the suspect and then froze, is getting very highly criticized on the internets, as they say. I'd like to just get your perspective on that. Is it unjustified in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it is. I think some of the comments here tonight have been a little crass and a little unwarranted. I think that nobody should try to put themselves in her shoes. She is basically a surviving victim of this attack. Whether she knew it then or not, she certainly knows it now. And that's a trauma doesn't have to happen at the moment. Trauma can happen afterwards. And she is completely traumatized by this. I am sure of it. She is, by the reading of the affidavit, and as an investigator, my concern is she's pretty much what we know now, the only eyewitness to this crime. So we have to preserve her mental state, and we have to preserve her testimony. We have to take care of her as much as possible because we're human beings, and she's been traumatized by this, and she's a surviving victim of this killer, in my opinion. And I think that no one should be judging her on her actions, unless you were in that house that night. No, she didn't know that the murders took place yet, but she knew there was a strange man wearing a mask walking through her house wearing all black. And a strange person that she had never seen before, apparently, or else she would have said that. So in the affidavit, she says she was fearful. She was frozen in fear. That's all we have to go by. There's no reason to not believe her. And so I believe that she was frozen in fear. I believe she's been traumatized by this event, but I believe she gave, expert eyewitness identification that led to him. And obviously it was important enough for them to include it in the affidavit. So I think everybody should just, the internet should just back off and not try to judge her or criticize her for her actions. There's a lot to be heard yet in this case. And, this young lady has been traumatized, and she needs our support and our help rather than our criticism.
Dr. Newton, to you, the question up on the screen, responding to Ariana Grande's ponytail, he'll be on death row for 10 years. That's the most likely outcome here. Can you talk about death row in the state of Idaho, and is that a fair assessment if convicted and found guilty?
Yeah, I would. There is a possibility they filed aggravated murder charges. So they have not indicated whether they are planning to pursue the death penalty at this point, but it certainly would fit the aggravators in Idaho, one being more than one victim, done in a particularly cruel, heinous, or atrocious manner. The vulnerability of the victims. All of those are aggravators in Idaho law that could make someone eligible for the death penalty. I know that if I were trying this case, you have to think as a defense attorney off the bat, you're doing two tracks. You're thinking about guilt and innocence on one hand. So are we worried about that? And that becomes a problem because you're also worried about what would the eventual sentence be. And if you're trying it with death in mind, then you're assuming that your client might get the death penalty. And so you're running sometimes two contradictory tracks, which are to try to persuade the jury that they're innocent. Now, the jury doesn't believe you. And then you're arguing, well, just kidding. Even though you don't believe us that he was innocent, now don't give him the death penalty. And now he doesn't look remorseful. But you have to be thinking the whole time about how you're going to play that. And if you're going to, if death is going to be an option, you have to think about death from the very beginning, which means understanding the defendant, understanding the defendant's life history. You're doing from day one and before even their life, trying to understand who they are and why they would have committed that crime to mitigate maybe some, whether it's mental illnesses or other things. And so if he were to be convicted in Idaho, there's going to be a series of appeals through the state Supreme Court all the way to the United States Supreme Court. There will be a state post-conviction proceeding, which will go all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And there would be a federal habeas petition that would go all the way to the United States Supreme Court. I think 10 years is an understatement. And Idaho's death row right now, people are pushing 20 to 30 years on death row. So this is not a quick fix. And in some ways, this is where some prosecutors say, well, let's not make this a capital case because we can actually end this case a lot quicker and not have to deal with endless appeals, give the victims a sense of finality. You don't have the execution, but it could be decades easily.
This next comment from Isagul Aksu, I apologize if I'm butchering that. The first part of this, Bobby, she saved her own life by freezing. She also helped the case. Does this person make a good and valid point here?
Yeah, I'm reading that point. Yes, the first part, yes, certainly. This person has not seen some of the more heinous things that I have seen, and my social media is wide open. And so, and we've talked about some of it tonight. But yeah, certainly there are people out there criticizing her. I've already seen comments on this thread, on this program tonight, that are a bit critical of her and stuff. So I think that there is some criticism happening out there. I hope it's tamped down. I hope those people think twice about it and it ends, because like I said, she's a witness to this case. She's a survivor, and we should help her and support her as much as possible.
Amen to that. Tim, I have a question here that came in earlier from Fairy Princess, and this is sort of the opposite side of what Bobby was just talking about. This is the defense poking holes in what she had to say, which is just a reality of the legal system. Fairy Princess writes, I think for one, the defense will question the witness identification. How did she see him in the dark? How did she have the wherewithal to get a description that accurate, yet be frozen with fear to the extent that she did not reach out to roommates in the house or help outside of the house when she saw a masked intruder that froze her with fear, according to the affidavit? There are grounds here for doubt with her story of events. From strictly a criminal defense standpoint, is this something that you would hop on?
Well, you got to wait and see when the girl gave the statement. Did they identify him? Did she look at a lineup? Did she give this description before they identified Bryan? And if she did his name, I mean, did it come out afterwards, or did she give this description before anybody had him linked? Because he matches the description of height. He matches the description of athletic ability or physique, and the bushy eyebrows. Those are the things she would be able to see depending on the light. Like, it's dark. If he had a mask, we don't know what kind of mask it was, but she saw eyebrows. And those are pretty key. And of course, you're going to look and see how it was done, how the interview took place, when did the interview take place, did she have a lawyer present, who was in the room, was there any suggestibility? If there's suggestibility, then we can move to, suppress it. But it sounds like, she only gave him a few things, few details, and they seem to happen and match this suspect.
Bobby, this question came in earlier tonight from Kathleen Jameson. She writes, I understand innocent until found guilty through a court of law, but in my opinion, Bryan's current demeanor would not be to his favor during a trial. He is very cold looking, emotionless, and unempathetic. What advice can his attorney give him, if she gives him any, on how to present himself less guilty, if that can be done? There is, besides the court of law, there's the court of public opinion. How big a factor is this in a case like this, Bobby?
Well, hopefully not. Hopefully it's not a factor, and the court of public opinion is not where the case is going to be tried, and the defense is going to have a fair opportunity to present a valid defense for Bryan. As far as, everybody's kind of trying to everybody's becoming, amateur profilers and saying it. Like, look, I think he shouldn't show any emotion. He should just try to be like I think people have certain expectations about how a guilty person should act or how an innocent person should act. And I think those are often misplaced. I think that he should just keep his mouth shut. He shouldn't show any emotions, and he should listen to the advice of his counsel, who will know best how he should act, because he's never been through a murder trial before. But whoever's assigned as his counsel most likely will be death certified and will have been through murder trials before. And so I think that he will be, he will have the opportunity, and he should listen to his counsel. But I don't think he's done anything in particular. I mean, people are judging him how he looks. I mean, he can't really change the physical structure of his face or his hairstyle. I mean, that's, so people look creepy in some people's opinions, and other people look innocent in other people's opinions. So it's really, I don't think he can do anything right now other than wait, get a competent counsel, and listen to the advice of his counsel.
Agent Duffy, this one's for you. The comment up on the screen now. Jennifer Coleman. I don't disagree with your assessment. They're talking, I guess, during the chat here. I worked with mental health patients, I assume, and have been stalked. This will happen again. We have huge issues behind closed doors. We started this show off talking about some of the uncorroborated writings of his as a teenager. Is there, in your opinion, anything that can be done? We see these horrific school shootings. They always say there was warning signs. Can anything be done to prevent these sorts of things from happening, or do we just live in too big a country with too many people with issues and it's a moot point?
Never a moot point, right? We're always striving, both law enforcement, medical, psychology, schools, every imaginable community element that's out there to try to identify what, if anything, that we could help put a lid on some of the violence that's out there. But at the same time, as we continue on, it seems like there is an uptick. There's an increase of one thing or another. There's also a tremendous amount of attention. I was just talking with somebody yesterday where it seems like more attention is provided to the violence and to the suspects and those who are charged or guilty of doing such acts, and very little that goes towards the victims. And of course, this show, each and every time, identifying those victims by names to counteract that point. But at the with some 28 years in law enforcement, I've seen things that increase. I know there are different items of study that try to go and help prevent things. However, we are where we're at, and people have the freedoms to move about, to do what they want to do. And regardless, we still are in a reactive mode. Schools do a great job to provide drills, etc., and security. But at the same time, there are plenty of vulnerabilities that exist, especially, I would say, in parts of the United States that probably haven't seen firsthand some of the violence that's exhibited throughout the country. I'm hopeful, though. We every day we strive to try to put a lid on this and act as a prevention. And I think this in and of itself is one. But we do live in a free society, and those freedoms, there are plenty of people who are looking to take advantage of others and commit horrible acts and criminal acts against members in society.
Agent Duffy, I like the optimism. I think we have to stay on that side of the spectrum for sure. Bobby, back to you on this comment here. KC76. Obviously, the major question that still lingers is 3 letters. Why? KC76 writes, I think he was jealous of handsome Ethan being there that day. He followed Kaylee's Instagram account, I presume, and saw pics of him with 5 women. There were no other pics like that before. I don't know exactly what they're speaking about here, but they did have a social media presence. Have you given thought as to why? And I know you're going to say you just follow the evidence, but I'm curious what you think may have triggered this event.
Yeah, Joe, I mean, you and I have talked about before, the why of it is always the least important thing for me as an investigator, right? The who, what, when, where, and why. It's not usually required by statute. Motive is nice. The prosecutors like to tell a story to the jury, but certainly statutorily, it's not required. Motive is one of those really nebulous things sometimes. I think KC76 is on the right track. I think there was some jealousy, whether he was one of these incels, this involuntarily celibate people or not. We'll find that out. But I think there was certain emasculation in his past. We know he was bullied by people in his younger life, and then he became a bully apparently. So I think that this person is on the right track. I'm not sure about the specifics. It could be, but I don't really know enough about his background to know the specifics. But clearly, this was a rage crime. And when you have rage against people that you're not intimately familiar with, they're not in your family, they're not in your social circle. When you have that kind of anonymous rage, if you will, it really comes from a building up of an attitude. And this attitude could have fostered online. It could have fostered it somehow in his personal life. But this kind of rage against somebody that you don't really know has to come from deep inside their psyche. And that had to manifest itself in certain past behaviors. And hopefully the investigators are looking at those past behaviors and how they manifest and ultimately ended. Now, sometimes when you look back and see those types of behaviors in someone's life, they don't always result in this kind of act. But you can reverse engineer it and say, from this kind of act, we now see certain behaviors, and it gives context to those previous behaviors. And so I think you will find something in his past that manifested a rage against people that were young, that were happy, that were good looking in his estimation, or whatever. Because other than that, to have this kind of homicidal rage at someone you really don't know and hasn't really wronged you, it has to come from somewhere.
Very fascinating. And we will find that out. Agent Duffy, I'm going to throw this back to you. I hadn't seen this, and I think this is sort of interesting from Miss Kitty, and I also don't know, for full disclosure, if this is true. I'll take her word for it right now. I would question why forensics didn't take the wreath off the door, though. The affidavit only said that he left through the sliding door, nothing about entering. I guess I'm not that detail conscious, and I should be. Investigators should be. If there's a wreath on that door, should it still be there?
Yeah, I imagine with all the camera angles of all the different news agencies taking pictures of the house, and the wreath was there prior to and still there for some time. It's a fascinating question. I couldn't answer why that wreath is on the front door, whether they entered or whether the suspect entered through the front door, had any connection with that front door. I'm not quite sure what that wreath, if anything. Obviously, they determined that the wreath itself is doesn't have the evidentiary value that other things in and around the house have. So the wreath remains.
Dr. Newton, thank you, Agent Duffy. Dr. Newton, you're a law professor. This is right up your alley. I'm sure your students ask you this question from Marcia Braga. I have a question, please. Someone reply. Does a criminal tell his attorney the truth about the crime and the lawyer defends anyway, or the criminal never tells the lawyer the truth? Your answer, Dr. Newton. And don't lie.
Criminal defense attorneys call this the cocktail party question, which is, if you've done any work, you get this question all the time. And maybe this is from the TV or movies where everyone thinks the client comes in and says, hey, I did it, and get me off. I'd say most of the time what happens is people will tell you they did it. It's pretty common. And you're just negotiating, plea bargaining. You spend a lot of time doing that. It is possible that this defendant may say, I did it and I want to go to trial anyway. That's a lawyer's ethical responsibility to make the state prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. So a lawyer could hold the state to its burden, and that's important for all of us for a different reason, which is we want the government to have solid cases when they bring them against people, and we want to make them prove it. So a lawyer can do that ethically. A lawyer cannot put on false evidence. So if the lawyer knows that the person is guilty, the lawyer can't present any evidence that the lawyer knows to be false. So they could hold them to their burden. This leads some defense attorneys to never ask the question, never ask the client whether they did it or not, because they don't want to know. I'll hold the government to its burden. Others will ask, and they want to know because they want to move forward kind of with confidence that they believe in the case and can support the defendant. My practice when I did this was to just ask them, what would you like me to do? Would you like me to move this? Are you saying, like, which direction do you want me to move this, toward a plea or toward a trial? And if they were, insisting they were innocent, then we moved forward that way.
Tim, I'm curious about how do you handle this with your clients? Do you ever flat out ask them? You probably don't want to know the answer.
No good defense attorney will ever ask his client what he did or what happened. You never want to know that, because it cuts off half of your defense. Because if he says he did it, you can't put him on the stand, have him get up there and deny it. What you ask him is, what are you accused of? Let me see the police report. What are you accused of? You don't need to know at that point whether he did it. As a defense lawyer, your job is to give him guidance, make sure that the government proves their case, make sure they introduce valid evidence, and then if there is a defense, then you will exercise it. And he may or may not testify. I have never asked a client, did you do it? I've never had a client come in and tell me they did it. I had a client one time told me a story, and I said, if you think I believe that, why would you want me to be your lawyer in the first place? But they try to tell you stories that are not true, and it doesn't help you asking them to tell you lies. So you do have ethical boundaries. Every day you have an ethical issue come up, which either conflict or ethics or contacting witnesses and them contacting witnesses that are sometimes inappropriate, not proper. So like every day it's like a law school exam, and I could give the professor law school exam questions, the things that I have to answer to my clients on a daily basis. But no, I would never ask my client. I never asked my client what they did.
As I surmised, I would not do that myself. I'm afraid to. I don't ask my kids what they did, let alone a client. Bobby, this is for a defense attorney, but I'm going to throw it to you because you're the former FBI guy. This is J. Thomas Reset, who is a friend of the show and very intelligent guy. And he says, what do you think about the sequence by which they say the warrant for cell phone was obtained? I'm not sure exactly how it was obtained. Do you? And is there anything that stands out to you?
No, I don't know how they obtained the warrant. I haven't seen, normally phone records, we get phone records through an administrative subpoena a lot of times, but I don't know the search warrant for his phone and how it was obtained. I know how the analysis was done as was explained earlier by a special team that just really has expertise in cell phones and cell towers and movements of that. But I don't know, obviously, if they got a warrant, there was probable cause to obtain the warrant, and in a probable cause, just like the probable cause affidavit we've already seen for the murder arrest, for a search warrant, you have to go and establish probable cause. So you have to say, we have reason to believe that there's evidence of a crime on this phone and we want to search it. And so that's the standard with any search warrant. There has to be specificity. You have to show why you think that it happened, and a judge or magistrate has to determine that, yes, you met the probable cause burden and you're allowed to get that warrant to search that phone, location, car, house, whatever.
Thank you, Bobby. Professor, this is in your wheelhouse here from Janelle Smith. We'll take a few more comments, get some closing remarks, and wrap it up. This one is from Janelle Smith. Can anyone shed light on the process of how his public defender was chosen? Is he allowed to request a new public defender? And if so, Dr. Newton, how many times?
So in Latah County, where this occurred, there is not a public defender office or agency. So lawyers individually have contracts with the county. And so his public defender was someone, I believe, from that roster of people who take cases. Now, I don't know about that person's qualifications for handling a capital case. Idaho maintains a roster of attorneys who are death qualified, that was mentioned earlier. And it will, if this is going to be a capital defense case, then it would require two death qualified attorneys. And so that may very well change down the line as to who his attorney is or what's happening there.
Thank you, Counselor. We have a question that was emailed to me today, and Agent Duffy, I'll toss this one to you. It comes from Jack Barger, and he writes, I believe he was involved in the unsolved disappearance of Dana Smithers, who I know nothing about, who disappeared 20 miles from his parents' home in Pennsylvania the same day he graduated from college there. Maybe has her DNA in his car, worth looking into. From an investigative standpoint, if they're unsolved homicides in northeastern Pennsylvania, what are detectives, FBI agents, people like you doing right now with regards to their cold case files?
Yeah, you have detectives, I would say, in both communities that are checking for any unsolved missing persons, homicides, etc. But the nice thing about this is you have now a starting point. You, by virtue of his arrest and a search warrant, I imagine that's been already executed, and his DNA, not gotten from a trash or anything like that, but directly from him, that specific evidence will then be uploaded into a database. And that DNA database, where you may have other unsolved crimes that had viable DNA evidence to be uploaded and waiting for a match. And so if that is one of those cases where there was DNA found at the scene and it hasn't come back to anybody, and it is now waiting in a database, waiting for somebody who's been arrested or search warrant executed on that person. And once that DNA is uploaded, just like a fingerprint, sometimes they just remain in limbo. And then once there's a match, the alert will be provided to that necessary agency that, hey, we have a match, and so begins your investigation. So there's tremendous amount of information that can be obtained as a result of this arrest to assist law enforcement with similar cases or missing persons or homicides, and to be able to see, can they move forward to identify and connect the dots or remain cold.
Thank you, Agent Duffy. Tim, there was a comment up there just a moment ago. Is it possible, after seeing the probable cause affidavit, that suspect Kohberger is innocent? Curious to see how you answer this, which is why I'm asking.
Well, he's innocent right now. He's always innocent until the state proves him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. They may have probable cause for his arrest, but I wouldn't say what we've seen so far is sufficient and has been introduced to a jury yet. So we don't know if some of that could be suppressed or not. So right now, when you go to pick the jury, how would you vote? If they don't say not guilty, then they're going to be excluded from the jury. And while we might hypothesize or think there's a pretty strong case, you have to make the system has to work, and for all of our own protections. Clarence Darrow said that. He said, I represent the rights of others to protect my rights. And that's why we take cases sometimes that are the unpopular, the not popular in the community. And you do it because sometimes you're the only person that can do it. So if the person is truly guilty, and I've had police officers tell me that young ones that made mistakes, thank you. I'm never going to make that mistake again. And I've become friends with them. And their reporting does get better. And sometimes you're like, man, I shouldn't have told him how to do that, because now he's not going to do that again. But the system works. Sometimes it's delayed. And I know there's problems with, people say public defenders, there are some really good public defenders. They're overworked. They got limited budgets, but there's some good lawyers. And the system does work. It's slowly, but that's why we have the system we have. It's great. They call their witness. I get to cross-examine them. And if you can stand up to cross-examination, the truth is supposed to come out.
Well said. There's a comment that I didn't put up from Michelle South that we should all listen to. And she writes, this is about the victims. Please remember that. It's always about the victims. This next question, Bobby, I'll throw to you. Does the panel feel interviewing killers, although great for future psychological studies for prevention, can also be detrimental? Do we give them too much attention, Bobby, even though that's not exactly the question?
Yeah, no, I get the question. This is a profiling question, right? And look, I worked for 4 years on a show, and I wrote on a show called Criminal Minds, which is all about FBI profilers. Look, I will be the first one to admit we completely overblow the role of a profiler in the FBI. They were out chasing criminals down the street with guns, and that's not what profilers do. And I can tell you, in 30 years of federal investigations, 27 with the FBI, I never used a profile in my cases. Profilers are best at serial crimes, serial rapists, serial killers, where there is a series of crimes that they can compare victims and compare crime scenes with. They do profile sometimes off a single incident like this. Although in this type of situation, I was asked very early on, do I think it was a man or a woman? So I said I thought it was a man, simply because the physicality of the person to carry this out was probably a male. That's not profiling. I wasn't being a profiler there. And quite frankly, I work with profilers every day now, writing movies and TVs, and they're great friends of mine. They do great work. However, I think that the role of the profiler through the show that I worked on, Criminal Minds, has kind of like blew them up. And I think that, you know, I was an investigator. Profilers worked for me. CSI guys worked for me. All of these people were specialists. I was the lead investigator. I put all the pieces together. I had experts out there doing the work in the laboratory or in the field helping me, and they were great at what they do, and I couldn't do what they did. But I was the one that was responsible for putting the case together, bringing it to a prosecutor, and I sat at the government table. And I'll echo a statement that was just made. I became a much better investigator after my first trial. When I sat at that government table next to my 2 assistant United States attorneys, and my case that I had worked on for 2 or 3 years was laid out bare, tested, pulled, and attacked. And then I got on the witness stand and I was not attacked, but I was cross-examined for days. That was an experience that provided me more benefit than anything I learned in the FBI Academy or anything I learned previous to that. And so I understood then what it took to get a piece of evidence before a jury and all the pitfalls that can come before that could stop that piece of evidence. And yes, it's about the victims. I get that. But for me, I worked for the people of the United States. I wanted to get the perpetrator convicted for the next victim. I couldn't do anything for the previous victim. So I saw my role not as a victim advocate, not as a family, advocate. I was there to get the person convicted if they did that crime and thereby prevent future victims of that person. And so, talking about homicides and homicidal maniacs and profiling and all that, that's great. There is a place for that. But this case, you can see how quickly this case was resolved if this person is guilty. And again, the presumption is there that he's not, that he's innocent. Without profiling, with good old-fashioned detective work, married with modern forensics, DNA, and genealogy. I think this was the perfect marriage of old-fashioned police work with high-tech, new high-tech techniques, and it resolved it with me lightning fast. I know people were a little frustrated with the police, but for a complicated crime scene in a quadruple homicide, to have the person in custody in 8 weeks when they had no previous known or significant contact with the victims is lightning fast. And I think the result of great police work and great partnership with the Moscow PD, with the Idaho State Police, with the FBI.
A snarky commenter says that Bobby Chacon had too much coffee today. And to that I say, he is a New Yorker, baby. I'm from Jersey. He's got the New York in him, and that's passion. He's got passion for what he does. So back off of Bobby Chacon. I'll be the first to back
and
you up.
And as an interesting note, I've never had one single cup of coffee in my entire life.
You don't need it, Bobby.
Never. I don't drink it.
Good for you, man. Green tea? Do you have green tea?
I do. I drink green tea every morning.
That's what I have. Great minds think alike. We'll make this the last comment right here. And we sort of talked about it, but we'll bring it back up. And I'm going to toss this one to Tim Jansen, and then we'll do some closing comments. Touch DNA is the least reliable type of genetic analysis. DNA is not infallible as many think. It's an interesting point, Tim, because when you hear DNA matches, in my mind at least, and I'm not an attorney, I think guilty. Should we be thinking that?
Well, there are DNA, touch DNA it's not the least reliable. It's not the strongest. It's not blood. It can be transferred. It doesn't tell you how long it's been there. All it can say is at some point, sometime, it was transferred to that item or that object. You can do the test and look at all the DNA and get your own expert, look at the lab and see. You can do all that stuff. But I'm not saying the DNA is the biggest piece of this case. I think the overall case together makes it a strong case. But the DNA, the sheath, that's going to be really hard to explain. How it's not the murder weapon, but the murder weapon apparently fit the sheath. So how did someone steal his knife and then used it to commit the crime? You got to look at those jurors, and you got to have a straight face when you make arguments like that. I don't think that passes the smell test.
Thank you, sir. On to some closing comments. You'll notice the two FBI guys both have goatees. First, Scott Duffy. He is the director of Wilmington University's Criminal Justice Institute. He gets a medal today because he came on last second to help us out. He's retired out of the Wilmington office. spent 20 years cracking all sorts of crimes, including gangs, bank robberies, worked on the fugitive task force. Agent Duffy, what are you looking for from an investigative standpoint over the next couple of days and weeks?
Lots of interviews. So the lab technicians are doing their thing, and I'm sure they're receiving lots and lots of more submissions. But now you have now you can go over, right? You can dive into family, friends, co-workers. There's now that you have a suspect identified, there are tremendous different avenues you can go. Following that car, following the phone, and plenty more interviews. So at this point, interview.
Thank you, sir. Special Agent Bobby Chacon is a retired FBI agent, an attorney, and a writer. He worked on the show Criminal Minds. He does it all. Bobby, does it irritate you that so many people out there think they can do your line of work when it took you years and years of hard work to get to where you are?
No, I think, that's fine if they think that. I know the truth, and it's the same thing in a lot of professions. A lot of people get second guessed, and but no, it doesn't bother me. There are a lot of amateur sleuths on the internet who do good work. There have been documented cases where true crime podcasts have unearthed years later valuable evidence or valuable witnesses or things. So I think there's a place for them. I think that there's a line that shouldn't be crossed, but I think that there's certainly a place for them. And I'm a fan of true crime podcasts myself that I listen to, and I think there's good work being done, by a lot of them out there. And I know that cold cases have been solved by some of them. So it does irk me a little bit when I hear some of the comments about it, but I've been dealing with that, since day one on the job, and my dad was a cop before me, and he told me to expect that, because no one's going to know how to do your job better than the person that you're pulling over, or that you're talking, that you're enforcing the law against. It's the old, why don't you go, you pull a speeder over, and they say, why don't you go after the drug dealers and stuff. And so everybody kind of has an idea. But in this modern world with the internet, yeah, it does seem like a lot of people are, have a much better idea how to do my job. Luckily, I didn't work for them.
Like to thank you and your father, and I think your brothers too, for your service. Tim Jansen, the man, R. Timothy Jansen. He is a criminal defense attorney out of the great state of Florida, Tallahassee specifically, which was at one point a temporary home to the infamous serial killer Ted Bundy. And Tim also was a federal prosecutor. Tim, from a defense attorney standpoint, what are they doing with the suspect right now? What's going on behind closed doors?
You mean for the defense?
Correct.
Well, hopefully they're getting their team together. Maybe they had a chance to actually sit down and talk to him. I'm sure the prosecutor and defense lawyer are talking. The FBI is so thorough. I just want to say I had a case. There was a bombing at FAMU, historical black college here. And there was a bombing, and it almost shut down the campus. Jesse Jackson came down, and the guy made a phone call from a payphone. FBI, I found out during the trial, took the payphone, put it on the FBI jet, flew it to DC, and they fingerprinted every coin that was in that telephone. I just found that was fascinating. They didn't get his fingerprint, but that tells you the details that the FBI has at their beck and call. So they're going to have a hard case here. That case I had was circumstantial, but the FBI, I mean, they're good. When they put their resources on a project, they are good. Very good.
They are among the best, if not the best, at what they do. And finally, a huge thanks and debt of gratitude to Dr. Samuel P. Newton from the University of Idaho, where this happened. Before joining the University of Idaho, Dr. Newton worked for both prosecuting and public defender organizations in Utah and Montana. He's a licensed attorney in Colorado, Montana, and Utah with a PhD. You can tell he's got a very good criminal mind, to use a Bobby Chacon title. Question for you, Dr. Newton. Suspect Bryan Kohberger is due back in court, I believe, on Thursday. What can we expect during this next hearing, and what are you looking for from a legal standpoint moving forward?
Yeah, I would gather that the next stage here is going to be looking toward a preliminary hearing. So this is where the judge will hear more of the evidence in the case. It may be just as much as we've seen in the affidavit, but it might also it will involve witness testimony. And the magistrate judge has to decide whether there's probable cause to bind him over for trial. So I gather they'll be working on that stage. Assuming he's bound over for trial, then he would move to the district court toward facing a trial and moving forward in that way. The judge may also be addressing issues of his counsel, bail, those other type of questions may be happening in the next few days.
Listen, thank you, panel. Greatly appreciated. Again, a special thanks to Dr. Newton. Dr. Newton, please send our greetings to the great city of Moscow, Idaho, and let them know that we are all thinking about them, especially the families so gravely affected by all of this. Don't you all worry. We'll be back soon enough with another episode of Surviving the Survivor. But for now, love you, America.